As a 68-year-old widow, everyone assumed I was just another burden living off my late husband's modest pension. My son Michael certainly thought so when he banished me to the dusty attic during his engagement party because it would be embarrassing to have you around the guests. What Michael didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I owned every single house in Willowbrook Estates, the exclusive subdivision where he and his fiancée Harper had been desperately trying to buy their dream home. While I listened to him boast to his wealthy friends about his upcoming real estate empire and mock his poor old mother, I made a decision that would shock them all. Sometimes the best way to teach respect is to show exactly who holds the real power. The next morning, I made some calls that changed everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I pulled the faded property deed from my jewelry box, running my fingers over the official seal that had been stamped 35 years ago. Charlotte Miller, sole owner of Willowbrook Estates Development. The signature was mine, though the confident flourish seemed to belong to a different woman entirely. Back then, I had been a young real estate agent with an eye for undervalued land and the audacity to leverage everything I had for a vision that others called foolish. That woman was me, though my son Michael would never believe it. To him, I was simply Charlotte, the 68-year-old widow who lived in the modest ranch house on Maple Street, clipping coupons and wearing cardigans from discount stores. The same woman he'd grown increasingly embarrassed by as his career in corporate finance flourished, and his social circle expanded to include the wealthy elite of Riverside County. If only he knew that every mansion in Willowbrook Estates, every perfectly manicured lawn and marble fountain, every property his fiancée Harper coveted and his friends envied, belonged to me. But that secret had served me well for decades, allowing me to observe human nature in its rawest form, to see who valued appearances over authenticity, who measured worth by bank statements rather than character. My journey to becoming Riverside, County's most unlikely real estate mogul, had begun with tragedy and opportunity intertwined. When my husband Robert died suddenly of a heart attack 15 years ago, Michael assumed I'd inherited just enough to scrape by. What he didn't know was that Robert and I had been partners in more than marriage. While he worked his steady job, at the insurance company, I had quietly built an empire. It started with that first property in 1988 when I was 33, and Michael was just 8 years old. The Willowbrook land was considered worthless then, 50 acres of marshy ground outside town that developers avoided. But I saw potential in its proximity to the planned highway expansion and the natural beauty of the old oak groves. I convinced Robert to co-sign the loan, promising him it would be our retirement security. He believed in me, even when the bank officer laughed at my business plan, even when our friends questioned our sanity for purchasing swampland, even when the first year brought nothing but drainage problems and mosquitoes. Robert would drive out there with me on weekends, helping me survey the property lines and dream about what it could become. The transformation took 5 years and every penny we could scrape together, plus several sleepless nights when I wondered if I'd bankrupted our family for a fantasy. But gradually, the vision materialized. The highway came through exactly as planned, bringing commerce and commuters. The wetlands were properly drained and developed into an exclusive subdivision featuring 35 custom homes on oversized lots, each one designed to harmonize with the preserved oak trees. Willowbrook Estates became the most prestigious address in Riverside County, home to doctors, lawyers, successful entrepreneurs, and old money families who wanted privacy and luxury. The property values soared beyond my wildest projections. What I'd purchased for $180,000 was now worth over $50 million in total value, generating substantial rental income from the 8 properties I'd kept as investments while selling the rest at enormous profits. But Robert and I had agreed early on to keep the extent of our success private. We'd seen how money changed relationships, how it brought out greed and entitlement in people we'd once trusted. So we continued living modestly in our original home, investing the profits in other ventures, building wealth quietly while maintaining the facade of middle-class comfort. When Robert passed away, I'd mourned not just my husband, but my closest confidant, the only person who truly understood the scope of what we'd built together. The loneliness of success without someone to share it with had been overwhelming, but I'd also felt a fierce protectiveness over our legacy, a determination to ensure it went to someone who would value it properly, rather than squander it on superficial luxuries. Michael had been 23 when his father died, fresh out of college and eager to make his mark in the financial world. He'd offered to help manage my affairs, speaking to me with the condescending patience reserved for elderly relatives who couldn't possibly understand complex financial matters. I'd politely declined, telling him I preferred to keep things simple, that his father had left me comfortable enough to manage on my own. The lie of omission had seemed harmless then. I'd expected Michael to mature, to develop the character and wisdom that would make him worthy of inheriting what Robert and I had built. Instead, he'd grown increasingly materialistic, measuring success by status symbols and social connections rather than integrity or compassion. His relationship with Harper Wilson had only intensified these tendencies. Harper came from old money, the kind of family that had been wealthy for so long they'd forgotten what it was like to work for anything. She was beautiful, educated, and utterly convinced of her own superiority. Her family's estate in the hills overlooked Willowbrook Estates, and she'd made it clear that living anywhere less prestigious would be beneath her standards. Michael had been trying to purchase one of the Willowbrook properties for 2 years, competing with other buyers and consistently being outbid. What he didn't realize was that I controlled the sales through a property management company, and I'd been deliberately steering the best houses to buyers who demonstrated character rather than just financial capacity. The irony was exquisite and heartbreaking in equal measure. My son spent his evenings complaining about the unfairness of the real estate market, about how deserving people like him and Harper couldn't get ahead because of mysterious wealthy investors who inflated property values. He'd grown bitter about his perceived disadvantages, never imagining that his own mother was the mysterious investor he railed against. Last month, when Michael announced his engagement to Harper, I'd felt a complex mixture of emotions: joy for his happiness, concern about Harper's values, and a growing certainty that I needed to evaluate whether he'd developed into someone worthy of the trust Robert and I had envisioned placing in him. That evaluation was about to begin in earnest. Michael had called 3 days ago with news that made my decision both easier and more painful than I'd anticipated. "Mom," he'd said, his voice carrying that familiar note of forced patience, "Harper and I are throwing an engagement party this Saturday. It's going to be quite elegant, very upscale. Her parents are flying in from Martha's Vineyard, and we'll have some very important people attending." I'd waited for the invitation that never came. "The thing is," he'd continued, "we're really trying to make the right impression. These are people who could be crucial for my career advancement, for our future together. I hope you'll understand that it might be better if you made yourself scarce that evening." The casual cruelty of his words had taken my breath away. Not anger, but a profound sadness that the child I'd raised could so easily dismiss his own mother as an embarrassment to be hidden away. "Where exactly am I supposed to go, Michael?" I'd asked quietly. "Oh, you don't need to leave the house," he'd said quickly, as if this made his request reasonable. "Just maybe stay upstairs in the guest room, keep a low profile. We're using the main floor for the party, and it would just be awkward having you around when we're trying to network with these influential people." The guest room. He meant the cramped space under the eaves that had once been storage, barely, large enough for a twin bed and accessible only by a steep, narrow staircase. The same room where he'd banished me during previous gatherings, each time with the same explanation about impressions and important people. But this time would be different. This time, I'd decided, It was time for Michael to learn exactly who he'd been dismissing as an embarrassment all these years. As I carefully returned the property deed to my jewelry box alongside the other documents that told the story of my hidden success, I felt a calm resolution settling over me. Tomorrow night's party would indeed make an impression on Harper's influential family and Michael's important colleagues, just not the impression he was expecting. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that made everything seem possible. I stood at my kitchen window, watching as an army of caterers, florists, and party planners descended upon my modest ranch house like well-dressed locusts. Michael had spared no expense for this engagement party, transforming our simple home into what he described as an elegant venue worthy of Harper's family. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here was my son, stretching his finances to impress people who would never truly accept him, all while the woman he was trying to hide away could have purchased the most exclusive country club in the state without checking her bank balance. "Mom, you need to stay out of the way today," Michael announced as he swept into the kitchen, his usually neat appearance already frazzled with pre-party stress. He wore an expensive suit I didn't recognize, probably purchased specifically for this occasion. The vendors have a lot of work to do, and Harper's parents arrive at 3. I don't want any confusion about anything. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I sipped my coffee calmly, watching him pace between the kitchen island and the window. "Of course, dear. I'll make myself invisible." He shot me a sharp look, uncertain whether my easy compliance was genuine or sarcastic. After 38 years of motherhood, I'd learned that sometimes the most effective response was simply to give people exactly what they claimed to want. Good. And remember, once the party starts at 7, you'll need to go upstairs and stay. There. Harper's father is a federal judge, and her mother sits on the boards of 3 major charities. These aren't people who will understand our situation. Our situation. As if poverty were contagious, as if my presence would somehow reveal the modest origins Michael was desperately trying to escape. "What exactly do you plan to tell them about me?" I asked, genuinely curious about how he intended to explain away his mother's existence. Michael's face flushed slightly. "I've told them you're visiting your sister in Florida for the month. It's cleaner that way, avoids awkward questions." The casual lie stung more than his earlier dismissal. Not only was I to be hidden, I was to be completely erased from his narrative, replaced with a fiction that better suited his social aspirations. "I see. And what if someone mentions seeing me around town?" "Riverside isn't that large, Michael." He waved dismissively. "Harper's parents don't shop at discount stores or frequent the places you go. There won't be any overlap." The contempt in his voice was so casual, so automatic, that I wondered when exactly my son had become this person. When had the boy who used to bring me dandelions and call them flowers become a man who spoke about his mother as if she were something shameful to be managed? By noon, the transformation of my home was complete. Professional landscapers had installed temporary lighting in the backyard, creating an enchanted garden effect around the old oak tree where Michael had once built a treehouse. Elegant round tables draped in ivory linens dotted the lawn, each centerpiece featuring flowers that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. The caterers had taken over my kitchen entirely, filling it with gourmet appetizers and champagne that I was certain cost more per bottle than most people spent on groceries in a week. Everything was beautiful, expensive, and completely foreign to the home where I'd raised my son with love, laughter, and the occasional boxed macaroni dinner. Harper arrived at 2:30, a vision in designer casual wear that probably cost more than my car. She was undeniably beautiful, with the kind of polished perfection that came from a lifetime of privilege. Her blonde hair fell in perfect waves, her makeup was flawless, and she moved with the confidence of someone who had never doubted her place in the world. "Mrs. Miller," she said, offering me a smile that didn't reach her eyes. How lovely to see you. Michael mentioned you'd be resting upstairs during the party. I do hope you're feeling well enough for that. The implication was clear. I was being presented as elderly and frail, someone who needed to rest early and couldn't handle the excitement of a sophisticated gathering. Another fiction to explain my absence. I'm feeling quite well, thank you, I replied pleasantly. But I understand you need the space for your celebration. Harper's parents arrived precisely at 3, stepping out of a luxury sedan that probably cost more than most people's houses. Judge William Wilson was a distinguished man in his 60s, carrying himself with the authority of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room. His wife, Patricia, was elegantly dressed and perfectly coiffed, scanning my humble home with the barely concealed disdain of someone visiting a quaint but inferior establishment. I watched from the kitchen window as Michael and Harper greeted them with the kind of nervous enthusiasm that suggested desperation beneath the surface charm. Michael's laugh was too loud, his gestures too animated. Harper kept smoothing her dress and checking her reflection in the glass doors. Charlotte, I presume? Judge Wilson's voice carried the particular tone that powerful men used when acknowledging the help. He'd appeared in my kitchen doorway while I was discreetly retreating toward the stairs. Yes, Your Honor, I replied, offering a polite smile. Harper tells me you're quite the homebody. How nice that you can be here to see Michael settled with such a lovely young woman. The condescension was expertly delivered, wrapped in courtesy, but unmistakably dismissive. I was being categorized as harmless domestic background, someone whose approval or disapproval was irrelevant to the larger proceedings. Michael is very fortunate, I agreed, choosing my words carefully. Indeed. Harper could have chosen from any number of suitable young men, but she saw something special in your son. We're pleased they've found each other. The message was clear. Harper was conferring a favor by accepting Michael, and the family was graciously allowing this union despite Michael's obviously inferior background. As the afternoon progressed and guests began arriving, I retreated to my bedroom to observe the gathering through my window. The backyard filled with elegantly dressed people, all of them clearly from the same social stratum as Harper's family. I recognized several faces from the society pages of the local newspaper: prominent attorneys, successful business owners, old money families who had been fixtures in Riverside County for generations. Michael moved among them with barely concealed anxiety, working too hard to fit in, his laugh still too loud, his stories slightly too eager. I watched him point toward the house occasionally, no doubt explaining my absence with the fabricated story about visiting Florida. Harper, meanwhile, held court near the champagne fountain, surrounded by well-dressed women who hung on her words about wedding plans and honeymoon destinations. She gestured occasionally toward the neighboring properties, and I caught fragments of conversation about house hunting and the impossible market prices in Willowbrook Estates. The property values, there are absolutely astronomical, I heard one woman say as the group moved closer to my window. Someone told me there's a mystery investor who owns half the development and won't sell at any price. Harper's laugh tinkled like expensive crystal. It's so frustrating. Michael has been trying to get us into Willowbrook for months, but every time we make an offer, we're outbid by ridiculous amounts. There's obviously some wealthy recluse manipulating the market. How dreadful, another woman sympathized. Young couples like you should have priority over these investor types who probably never even visit their properties. I smiled to myself. If only they knew that the wealthy recluse was listening to every word from 20 feet away, dressed in a discount store cardigan and preparing to spend the evening in what my own son had described as the equivalent of servants' quarters. At 6:30, Michael appeared at my bedroom door with the same expression he might have worn when asking me to take out the garbage. Time to go upstairs, Mom. Guests will be arriving for dinner soon, and we need the house to feel, well, you know. I gathered my book and a glass of water, preparing for my exile to the cramped attic room. As I climbed the narrow stairs, I could hear the party coming to life below. Laughter, clinking glasses, the murmur of conversation among people who had never doubted their place in the world. At the top of the stairs, I paused at the small window that overlooked the backyard. The scene below was undeniably beautiful, soft lighting casting everything in a golden glow, elegant people enjoying gourmet food and expensive wine, my son finally getting the sophisticated gathering he'd always dreamed of hosting. But as I settled into the uncomfortable chair in the tiny room where I was expected to spend the evening invisible and forgotten, I felt something shift inside me. This wasn't just about hurt feelings or wounded pride. This was about respect, dignity, and the fundamental question of how we treat the people we're supposed to love most. Tomorrow, I decided, would bring some long overdue clarity to Michael's understanding of exactly who he'd been treating as an embarrassment. But tonight, I would play the role he'd assigned me one final time, listening from my exile as he celebrated his future with people who would never truly accept him, all while remaining completely unaware that his greatest asset was the woman he'd banished to the attic. The attic room felt smaller than I remembered, though perhaps that was simply the weight of humiliation pressing down on me like the slanted ceiling that forced me to duck when moving away from the center of the space. A single bare bulb cast harsh shadows across the cramped quarters, illuminating the twin bed with its thin mattress, the rickety nightstand, and the cardboard box that served as my only storage. This was where my son had decided I belonged while he entertained the social elite in the home I had provided for him. The home where I had raised him with love and sacrifice. The home I could replace tomorrow without affecting my bank balance. Through the thin floor, I could hear the party coming to life. Footsteps clicked across the hardwood floors I had refinished, myself 20 years ago. Laughter bubbled up from the living room where Michael had taken his first steps. Conversation flowed around the dining table where we had shared thousands of meals, where I had helped him with homework and listened to his dreams about the future. But tonight, I was relegated to this forgotten space like an embarrassing family, secret, invisible, and silent while strangers occupied my home and judged my worth by my discount store clothing and modest lifestyle. I settled into the uncomfortable wooden chair by the small window, opening the book I had brought for company. But concentration proved impossible as voices drifted up through the heating vents, carrying conversations that made my exile feel even more pointed and deliberate. "Michael, darling, your home is absolutely charming," I heard Patricia Wilson's voice, polished and patronizing. "So authentic. It reminds me of the farmhouse my grandmother owned in Vermont. Quite rustic." Harper's nervous laugh followed. "We're definitely planning to upgrade once we're married. Michael has his eye on Willowbrook Estates, actually. It's just a matter of timing and finding the right property." "Willowbrook is lovely," another woman chimed in. "Though I hear the market there is impossible right now. Some mysterious investor is buying up everything and driving prices through the roof. Terribly selfish, really, keeping beautiful homes away from families who would actually live in them." I almost smiled at the irony. These people were literally standing in my home, dismissing me as irrelevant, while complaining about my business practices without having any idea they were talking about their host's supposedly impoverished mother. "It's incredibly frustrating." Michael's voice carried a bitter edge that surprised me. "Harper and I are exactly the kind of buyers Willowbrook should attract. Young professionals, established careers, ready to be part of the community. But we keep getting outbid by investors who probably never even visit the properties. Have you considered making a personal appeal to the seller?" Judge Wilson's authoritative tone suggested he was accustomed to solving problems through influence rather than merit. "Sometimes a face-to-face conversation can accomplish what anonymous offers cannot. We've tried, but the properties are managed through some secretive company. Everything goes through intermediaries. It's like trying to negotiate with a ghost. If only he knew how close to the truth he was." The ghost was sitting directly above his head, listening to him complain about the very opportunities I had been withholding until he demonstrated the character worthy of inheriting them. As the evening progressed, the conversations grew more revealing. Without my presence to remind them of discretion, the guests spoke freely about their views on social hierarchy, their assumptions about worth and value, their casual dismissal of anyone who didn't meet their standards of success. I do think it's admirable how Michael has risen above his circumstances, Patricia Wilson observed during what sounded like the main course. Not everyone can overcome a modest background to achieve real success. Harper has been such a positive influence, another guest added. Before they met, he was quite content with less ambitious goals. She's helped him see what's possible when you associate with the right sort of people. The implication was clear. I represented the wrong sort of people, the modest background that needed to be overcome, the limitation that Harper's influence was helping Michael transcend. Mother's visit to Florida has been perfectly timed, Harper said, her voice carrying just enough volume to ensure I would hear through the thin walls. It gives us space to entertain properly without worrying about complications. More laughter followed, the kind of knowing chuckles that suggested everyone understood exactly what complications I might represent. Too shabby for their standards, too unsophisticated for their conversations, too ordinary for their carefully curated social experience. But as I listened to Harper describe her vision for their future together, I began to understand that my exile wasn't just about embarrassment. It was about erasure. She wasn't just asking me to stay out of sight. She was planning to write me out of Michael's story entirely. Once we're settled in Willowbrook, we'll be able to entertain the way we should, Harper continued. Proper dinner, parties, charity fundraisers, the kind of social calendar that supports Michael's career advancement. It will be such a relief to have adequate space and appropriate surroundings. And what about Michael's mother? Someone asked. Will she be nearby to help with grandchildren someday? The pause that followed was telling. When Harper finally responded, her voice carried the careful tone of someone navigating delicate social waters. Charlotte is quite independent and set in her ways. She's comfortable in her current situation. I think we'll probably encourage her to consider one of those lovely senior communities where she can be around people more her own age and activity level. Senior communities. She was planning to warehouse me in some institutional setting, clearing the path for a life where Michael's humble origins could be completely forgotten, where his background could be rewritten to better suit her family's expectations. The conversation moved on to wedding plans and honeymoon destinations, but I remained frozen in my chair, processing the casual cruelty of what I had just heard. This wasn't just about hiding me for one evening. This was about permanently removing me from Michael's life, relegating me to occasional, carefully managed visits that wouldn't interfere with the sophisticated image they were constructing. Around midnight, the party began winding down. I heard cars starting in the driveway, voices calling out final pleasantries, the sounds of caterers cleaning up the remnants of the elegant evening. Through my small window, I watched luxury vehicles disappear into the night, carrying their occupants back to their own comfortable worlds where they would never have to confront the reality of someone like me. Michael's voice drifted up from the kitchen as he and Harper reviewed the evening's success. I think that went perfectly, Harper said, her satisfaction evident. Your boss seemed genuinely impressed, and my parents were charmed by your transformation of this place. We should definitely do more entertaining like this. Absolutely. Though, we'll need to figure out the mother situation for future events. Maybe we can encourage her to visit your aunt in California more often. The mother situation. 24 hours ago, I had been his mother. The woman who had raised him, supported his dreams, and quietly built the fortune that could have secured his future. Tonight, I had become a situation to be managed, a problem to be solved, an obstacle to be removed from his path to social acceptance. But as I finally settled into the uncomfortable bed, listening to the house grow quiet beneath me, I felt something unexpected. Not just hurt or anger, but a crystalline clarity about what needed to happen next. For 38 years, I had protected Michael from the consequences of his choices, smoothed his path, provided safety nets he never knew existed. I had watched him grow increasingly entitled, increasingly dismissive of the values Robert and I had tried to instill, increasingly convinced that he deserved success without sacrifice, respect without earning it. Tomorrow would mark the end of that protection. Tomorrow, Michael would learn that actions have consequences, that disrespect carries a price, and that the woman he had dismissed as an embarrassment held the power to transform his life in ways he couldn't imagine. But tonight, for the last time, I would play the role he had assigned me, the invisible, irrelevant mother who could be safely ignored while he pursued his dreams of social elevation. Tomorrow would bring revelations that would shatter every assumption he had made about power, wealth, and the true nature of the woman he had banished to the attic. As sleep finally came, I dreamed not of revenge, but of justice, not of punishment, but of education. Michael was about to receive the most expensive lesson of his life, though he had no idea yet who would be presenting the bill. Sunday morning brought an unusual quiet to the house, the kind of stillness that follows a storm. I descended from my attic exile at dawn, finding the remnants of last night's elegant party scattered throughout my home. Empty champagne bottles, forgotten napkins, and the lingering scent of expensive perfume mixed with cigar smoke that had no place in my modest living room. Michael and Harper were still asleep, no doubt exhausted from their performance as the perfect couple ascending to their rightful place in society. I moved quietly through the house, observing the casual disrespect embedded in every detail of how they'd appropriated my space. My family photographs had been removed from the mantelpiece and stored in a closet, replaced with generic decorative objects that suggested no personal history. The bookshelf that held my teaching awards and Robert's commendations had been rearranged to hide anything that might reveal our middle-class background. Even my houseplants had been relocated to less visible positions, as if the modest African violets I'd nurtured for years were somehow inappropriate for sophisticated entertaining. But it was in Michael's bedroom, while retrieving a sweater I'd loaned him months ago, that I discovered the true scope of their deception. His laptop lay open on the dresser, and what I saw on the screen stopped me cold. An email chain between Michael and Harper, discussing their situation with frank calculation. That took my breath away. The subject line read, "Managing the mother problem long term." I sat heavily on the edge of his bed, reading words that revealed just how thoroughly they had planned my erasure from their lives. Harper's message, sent just 2 weeks ago, laid out their strategy with chilling precision. "Darling, we need to address the Charlotte situation before the engagement party. My parents are already questioning why they haven't met your mother, and I can't keep making excuses forever. But having her at the party would be social suicide. You know how she dresses, how she talks about penny pinching and discount shopping. It would undermine everything we've worked to establish about your background. I've been researching senior living communities in Florida, near your fictional aunt. Sunset Manor has an excellent reputation and reasonable rates that wouldn't strain your finances too much. We could present it as a wonderful opportunity for her to enjoy her golden years in a warmer climate with people her own age. The timing is perfect. Once we're married and settled in Willowbrook, we can gradually reduce contact to holiday cards and brief phone calls. My parents need never know about her limitations." Michael's response had been even more heartless. "You're absolutely right about the party. I've told her she needs to stay upstairs during the entire event. I'm calling it consideration for her need to rest, but really, it's the only way to avoid awkward questions. The Florida plan is brilliant. I've been looking at her finances, and she's got enough saved to cover a decent facility for several years. The house is paid off, so selling it would provide additional funds. I could manage her accounts to ensure the money lasts. And frankly, she's not sophisticated enough to question the arrangements. The beautiful thing is that once she's settled in Florida, visits become logistically difficult. We can maintain the appearance of being dutiful while keeping actual interaction to a minimum. By the time we have children, they'll barely know they have a grandmother on my side. There were more emails detailing their research into various facilities, their plans for liquidating my assets, their calculations about how long my imagined modest savings would last in institutional care. They had even discussed which of my possessions they might want to keep as sentimental mementos after relocating me. But the final email in the chain, sent yesterday afternoon while I was being hidden away upstairs, revealed the full depth of their conspiracy. Harper. The party was perfect. Everyone was impressed. Judge Morrison mentioned that his firm is always looking for ambitious young associates, and the Hendersons invited us to their charity gala next month. You were right to keep Charlotte out of sight. I overheard Patricia telling Mother that you've overcome your humble beginnings admirably, and that I'm doing wonderful work elevating your social prospects. This is exactly the narrative we need. I think we should accelerate the Florida timeline. Once we're married in June, we should present the move as a wedding gift, a chance for her to start fresh in a beautiful retirement community while we begin our life together. By next Christmas, this problem will be completely resolved. Michael. Agreed. I've already started conversations with a realtor about listing the house. The market is good right now, and this neighborhood is becoming more desirable as the city expands. We should be able to get enough to cover several years of care. Maybe more if we're strategic about finding an economical facility. I feel bad about the deception, but sometimes you have to make hard choices for everyone's benefit. She'll be happier, around people her own age, and we'll be free to build the life we deserve without constantly managing her limitations. I set the laptop down with trembling hands, my heart pounding with a combination of rage and profound sadness that threatened to overwhelm me. This wasn't just casual dismissal or temporary embarrassment about my modest lifestyle. This was a calculated campaign to steal my home, control my finances, and exile me to institutional care so they could erase me from their carefully constructed narrative. They had researched facilities, calculated costs, and planned my future, without any intention of consulting me. They had discussed my death as a logistical inconvenience, wondering whether I might live long enough to deplete the funds they planned to extract from selling my property. But what struck me most painfully was Michael's casual reference to her limitations. To my own son, I had become not a person with feelings, preferences, and autonomy, but a collection of embarrassing traits that needed to be managed and ultimately hidden away. I walked to the window overlooking the backyard where Michael had played as a child, where we had hosted birthday parties and barbecues, where Robert had taught him to throw a baseball and I had bandaged his scraped knees. The same space that had been transformed last night into a stage for his performance as someone completely divorced from his origins. The irony was so profound it was almost laughable. They were planning to liquidate my modest assets to fund my exile, completely unaware that I possessed the financial power to purchase every senior living facility in Florida if I chose to. They were scheming to control my imagined nest egg while I sat on a fortune that dwarfed their wildest ambitions. But more than the financial miscalculation, they had fundamentally misunderstood who they were dealing with. They saw a confused, dependent elderly woman who could be easily manipulated and discarded. They had no concept that they were plotting against a person who had built an empire through strategic thinking, careful planning, and the ability to see opportunities others missed. I returned to the kitchen and made coffee, my mind crystallizing around a decision that felt both inevitable and liberating. For years, I had watched Michael drift toward values that contradicted everything Robert, and I had tried to teach him. I had made excuses, hoping he would mature, believing that love and patience would eventually guide him back to his better nature. But the emails had revealed something beyond immaturity or social climbing. They showed a willingness to betray family, to lie and manipulate for personal advantage, to treat another human being as an obstacle to be removed rather than a person deserving of respect and dignity. This wasn't just about hurt feelings or wounded pride. This was about fundamental character, about the kind of person Michael had chosen to become and the values he had decided to embrace. As I sipped my coffee in the morning light, surrounded by the remnants of their elegant deception, I began to formulate a response that would address not just their immediate scheme, but the deeper lesson they desperately needed to learn. By the time Michael and Harper emerged from their bedroom, refreshed and satisfied with their successful evening, I had made my calls and set in motion a chain of events that would forever alter their understanding of power, wealth, and the consequences of underestimating the woman they had dismissed as a mere inconvenience. They had planned my exile with such careful attention to detail. It seemed only fair that I should reciprocate with the same level of strategic thinking. After all, I had been building and executing complex plans for decades, accumulating resources and influence they couldn't imagine. Today, they would begin to discover exactly who they had been plotting against. And tomorrow, the real education would begin. Michael emerged from his bedroom at nearly 11, looking pleased with himself in the way that follows a successful performance. He found me in the kitchen, quietly cleaning the last of the party, dishes that the caterers had left behind, playing the role of the dutiful mother tidying up after her son's important social event. "Morning, Mom," he said, pouring himself coffee with the casual air of someone who had nothing to feel guilty about. "I hope the party wasn't too disruptive for you upstairs. I know it got a bit loud." I continued washing champagne flutes, each one probably worth more than my weekly grocery budget. "Not at all, dear. It sounded like everyone had a wonderful time." They did. Harper's parents were really impressed, and I think I made some valuable connections for work. He settled at the kitchen table, scrolling through his phone with obvious satisfaction. Judge Wilson mentioned some opportunities at his firm, and the Hendersons want us at their charity gala next month. The casual way he spoke about us, meaning himself and Harper, while I remained invisible in his narrative, struck me as particularly telling. But I simply nodded encouragingly, playing the supportive mother role he expected. "That sounds wonderful, Michael. I'm so happy things are going well for you." Harper appeared a few minutes later, looking effortlessly elegant, even in casual clothes, that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. She surveyed the kitchen with the proprietary air of someone already planning changes. "Charlotte, thank you for staying out of the way last night," she said with that bright, condescending tone she reserved for addressing the help. "It made everything so much smoother." "Of course, dear. I wouldn't want to interfere with your special evening." She exchanged a meaningful look with Michael, one of those silent communications between couples who share secrets. If only they knew how clearly I could read their conspiracy, how thoroughly I understood their plans for my future. "Actually, Mom, Harper and I wanted to talk to you about something exciting," Michael said, his voice taking on the artificially enthusiastic tone he used when trying to sell me something I didn't want. "We've been thinking about your situation, about how you might enjoy your retirement more." I dried my hands carefully, giving them my full attention. "Oh? What kind of thoughts?" Harper stepped forward, her smile bright and persuasive. "Well, you've been in this house for so long, and it must be getting difficult to maintain. All these stairs, the yard work, the general upkeep, it's really too much for someone your age. We've been researching some wonderful retirement communities," Michael continued. "Places where you could have your own apartment but also access to activities, meals, people your own age, no more worrying about housework or yard maintenance." I nodded thoughtfully, as if considering this generous offer for the first time. "That does sound interesting. Where were you thinking?" "Florida," Harper said immediately. "The weather is so much better for seniors, and there are some beautiful facilities near the coast. We found one called Sunset Manor that has excellent reviews and very reasonable rates. And the timing would be perfect," Michael added. "After Harper and I get married, we'll need more space anyway. This house is really too small for a couple planning to start a family." The audacity was breathtaking. They were presenting their scheme to steal my home and exile me to institutional care, as a favor they were doing for me, a generous solution to problems I didn't know I had. "It sounds like you've put a lot of thought into this," I said mildly. "We have," Harper beamed. "And the best part is, selling this house in the current market would provide more than enough to cover the costs. You'd be completely comfortable, and Michael and I could start fresh here without worrying about your well-being." "When were you thinking this might happen?" I asked, continuing to play the role of the cooperative elderly mother grateful for their concern. "Well," Michael hesitated, clearly not wanting to admit how quickly they wanted me gone. "We thought maybe after the wedding. Give you time to adjust to the idea, but also let us start our married life properly." "I see. And you've already contacted this Sunset Manor place?" They exchanged another glance, this one slightly nervous. They hadn't expected me to be quite so accepting of their plan. "We've done some preliminary research," Harper said carefully, "but we wanted to talk to you first, of course." Of course, after they'd already calculated the costs, researched facilities, and planned the timeline for liquidating my assets. But I simply nodded understanding. "That's very thoughtful of you both. I appreciate you looking out for my best interests." Over the next several hours, I played my role perfectly. I asked questions about Florida weather, expressed concern about the logistics of moving, wondered aloud about making new friends at my age. I was the picture of an elderly woman overwhelmed by the generosity of her thoughtful children, grateful for their guidance in navigating this major life transition. But while I maintained this facade, I was also making phone calls during the brief moments when they were distracted. A call to my property manager about accelerating certain transfers. A conversation with my attorney about updating specific documents. A brief discussion with my banker about liquidating some investments for immediate access to cash. By afternoon, I had set in motion a series of events that would fundamentally alter the power dynamic in our household, though Michael and Harper remained blissfully unaware of the approaching storm. "Mom, we were thinking," Michael said as we prepared Sunday dinner together. "Maybe we could drive down to Florida next weekend, just to look at some places, get a feel for the area. No pressure, just exploring options." "That sounds lovely," I agreed. "Though I should mention, I might have some scheduling conflicts coming up." "Scheduling conflicts?" Harper looked puzzled. "What kind of conflicts could you possibly have?" The dismissive tone was so automatic, so casually contemptuous, that I almost smiled. The idea that I might have plans, commitments, or activities that mattered was clearly beyond her comprehension. "Oh, just some business matters I need to handle," I said vaguely. "Property management issues, that sort of thing." Michael laughed. "Mom, you don't have any property to manage. What are you talking about?" I continued chopping vegetables for the salad, keeping my expression neutral. "Just some investments your father and I made years ago. Nothing complicated, but they do require occasional attention." "Investments?" Harper's voice carried that particular tone of polite skepticism. "What kind of investments?" "Real estate, mostly. Robert always said land was the safest investment." They exchanged yet another look, this one tinged with the kind of indulgent patience adults show toward children who tell elaborate stories about imaginary friends. "That's nice, Mom," Michael said gently. "But you don't need to worry about any of that anymore. Once we get you settled in Florida, Harper and I can handle any paperwork or business matters. You'll be free to just enjoy yourself." The condescension was so complete, so automatic, that I wondered if they even heard themselves. They had decided. I was incapable of managing anything more complex than choosing what to wear each morning, and no evidence to the contrary could penetrate their certainty about my limitations. "You're very kind," I said, continuing to play the grateful mother role. "I don't know what I'd do without you looking out for me." As evening approached and Harper prepared to return to her apartment, she pulled me aside for what she clearly considered a heart-to-heart conversation. "Charlotte, I want you to know how much I appreciate your cooperation about last night and about our plans for your future. I know change can be scary at your age, but Michael and I really do want what's best for you. I understand, dear. You're both just trying to help. Exactly. And I hope you know that even after you move to Florida, you'll always be part of our family. We'll visit whenever we can, and you'll always be welcome to come back for special occasions. The generous offer to occasionally allow me to visit my own son was delivered with such gracious condescension that I had to admire her performance. She genuinely believed she was being magnanimous, offering me the privilege of remaining peripherally connected to the family I had created and raised. That's very generous of you, Harper. I'm grateful to have such thoughtful children looking after me. After she left, Michael helped me finish cleaning up the kitchen, his mood expansive with the success of their manipulation. I have to say, Mom, you're handling this whole transition idea much better than I expected. I was worried you might be resistant to change. At my age, dear, you learn to adapt. And you and Harper clearly have everything well thought out. We do, and I promise, once you're settled in Florida, you'll wonder why you waited so long to make the move. It's going to be perfect for everyone. Perfect for everyone. As I prepared for bed that night, I reflected on just how perfectly their plan was about to work out, though not quite in the way they anticipated. Tomorrow would bring the first phase of their education about the woman they had so thoroughly underestimated. They had spent weeks calculating how to liquidate my modest assets and planning my exile to institutional care. It seemed only fair that they should discover exactly what assets they had been plotting to steal and precisely who they had been, scheming to discard like an unwanted piece of furniture. The game was about to begin, and for the first time in months, I was looking forward to Monday morning. Monday morning arrived with unseasonable warmth for October, as if the universe itself was preparing for the dramatic events about to unfold. I woke before dawn, dressed carefully in one of my better outfits, not expensive, but dignified, and made coffee while reviewing the documents my attorney had delivered to my doorstep at precisely 6 a.m. Everything was in order. The property transfers had been completed over the weekend through emergency filings that my legal team had expedited. The bank statements showing my true financial position had been updated to reflect recent transactions. The ownership documents for Willowbrook Estates were compiled in a neat folder, each deed bearing my signature and the official seals that proved my control over Michael's dream neighborhood. By the time Michael emerged from his bedroom at 8:30, I was sitting calmly at the kitchen table, the morning newspaper spread before me as if this were any ordinary day. "Morning, Mom," he said, moving toward the coffee maker with the relaxed confidence of someone whose plans were proceeding perfectly. "Harper's coming over around 10. We thought we'd start looking at some travel websites, maybe plan that Florida trip for next weekend." "That sounds lovely, dear," I replied, not looking up from the paper. "Though I should mention, I have some business appointments today that might interfere with our planning." He paused, coffee mug halfway to his lips. "Business appointments? Mom, what kind of business could you possibly have?" The dismissive tone was so automatic, so deeply ingrained, that I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Property matters, as I mentioned yesterday. Some documents need to be signed, some transfers need to be finalized. Michael set down his mug with the exaggerated patience of someone dealing with an elderly relative's delusions. "Mom, you don't own any property except this house. And we've already discussed how selling it will fund your move to Florida. What transfers are you talking about?" I folded the newspaper carefully, meeting his eyes directly for the first time in months. "Actually, Michael, there are quite a few things we need to discuss. Perhaps you should call Harper and ask her to come over earlier. This conversation involves both of you." Something in my tone must have registered because his expression shifted from patronizing patience to uncertainty. "What kind of conversation?" "The kind where we address some misconceptions that have been allowed to persist far too long." An hour later, Harper arrived looking perfectly put together in a designer outfit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. She swept into the kitchen carrying her tablet and a folder of printed materials about Florida retirement communities. "I've found some absolutely wonderful options," she announced brightly, spreading colorful brochures across my kitchen table. "Sunny Palms has a golf course, and Ocean View Manor offers art classes and book clubs, perfect for someone with your interests." I smiled pleasantly, gathering the brochures into a neat stack. How thoughtful. But before we discuss my future, I think it's time we addressed some fundamental misunderstandings about my present situation. Michael and Harper exchanged one of their meaningful looks, the kind that had become so familiar over the past few days. "What kind of misunderstandings?" Harper asked, her voice taking on that carefully modulated tone she used when managing difficult situations. I reached for the folder I'd placed on the counter earlier, setting it on the table between us. "The kind that involve assumptions about my financial situation, my property holdings, and my decision-making capacity." "Mom?" Michael began, his voice gentle in the way that suggested he thought I was becoming confused. "We've been over this. You don't have property holdings. Dad left you comfortable but not wealthy. That's why we're trying to help you plan for long-term care." I opened the folder, removing the first document and placing it before them. It was a property deed, official and unmistakable, bearing my name as sole owner. "This is the deed to 1247 Willowbrook Drive," I said calmly. "Purchased in 1995, currently valued at approximately $1.8 million. Harper's eyes widened as she read the document, her perfectly composed expression faltering for the first time since I'd known her. This can't be right. That's the Morrison house. They've been trying to sell it for months." I placed a second deed on the table. 1391 Willowbrook Drive, purchased in 1997, valued at $2.1 million. Then a third. 1456 Willowbrook Terrace, purchased in 1999, valued at $1.9 million. Michael was staring at the documents as if they were written in a foreign language. "I don't understand. These have to be forgeries or mistakes or..." I continued, placing deeds on the table, one after another, each one bearing my signature and official seals. The pile grew larger as Harper's face grew paler. 3 Willowbrook Circle. 1798 Willowbrook Lane. 1834 Willowbrook Court. I paused to meet their stunned gazes. "Shall I continue? I have 28 more." The kitchen fell into the kind of silence that follows a thunderclap, complete and ringing. Harper's mouth had fallen open in a most undignified way, while Michael seemed to have forgotten how to breathe. 31 properties in total, I continued conversationally. All purchased over the past 25 years, all currently generating rental income or appreciation. The total portfolio value, according to the most recent appraisal, is approximately $52 million. Harper made a sound that might have been a whimper. Michael's coffee mug slipped from nerveless fingers, shattering on the floor in a spray of ceramic and coffee that none of us moved to clean up. "But that's impossible," Michael whispered. "You're a retired teacher. Dad was an insurance agent. Where would you have gotten that kind of money?" I placed the final document on the table, a comprehensive financial statement that detailed not just the property portfolio, but the associated bank accounts, investment funds, and business entities I controlled. The initial investment came from a small inheritance when I was 33. Your father and I agreed that I should handle the real estate ventures while he focused on his career. Over the years, one property funded the next. Appreciation built equity, and careful management multiplied our returns. Harper was scanning the financial statement with the desperate intensity of someone looking for evidence that this was all an elaborate hoax. "The management company," she said suddenly. "All the properties in Willowbrook are managed by Miller Holdings LLC. That's me," I confirmed. Miller Holdings has been my business entity for property management for over 2 decades. Every offer you and Michael have made on Willowbrook properties has crossed my desk." The color drained from Michael's face as the full implications hit him. You knew we were trying to buy there. I could have sold you any property you wanted. Yes. At a fair price, with favorable terms. As a wedding, gift, or family investment. I leaned back in my chair, studying their shocked faces. But you never asked me. You never included me in your plans. Instead, you decided I was an embarrassment to be hidden away, a burden to be managed, an obstacle to your social advancement. Harper was frantically shuffling through the documents, as if mathematical equations might somehow explain away the reality staring her in the face. "This changes everything," she muttered. "The Florida plan, the house sale, everything we discussed. Everything. You planned without consulting me," I corrected gently. "Everything you arranged for my benefit while assuming I was too simple to understand complex financial matters." Michael finally found his voice, though it came out as a croak. "Why didn't you tell us? All this time watching us struggle with mortgage applications and down payments, watching us get outbid on properties. Why didn't you say something?" I considered his question carefully before answering. "Because I wanted to see what kind of people you would become when you thought I had nothing to offer you. I wanted to understand whether your affection was genuine or transactional, whether you valued me as a person or saw me merely as a resource to be managed." The silence that followed was deafening. Harper stared at the documents as if they might spontaneously combust and solve her problems. Michael looked around the kitchen as if seeing it for the first time, perhaps finally understanding that he had been living in a home owned by the woman he'd been planning to exile to institutional. "Got it. Saturday night," I continued, my voice remaining calm despite the emotional storm I felt building inside me. "While you entertained your important guests and hid me in the attic like a shameful secret, I listened to conversations about my limitations, my inadequacies, my unsuitability for your sophisticated social circle." Harper flinched as if I'd struck her. "And yesterday, I discovered emails detailing your plans to liquidate my modest assets to fund my exile to a Florida care facility. Plans made without my knowledge or consent, based on assumptions about my helplessness and your authority to make decisions about my life." Michael's face had gone from pale to ashen. "Mom, those emails, we were trying to help. You thought you could steal my home, control my finances, and warehouse me in institutional care so that I wouldn't interfere with your social climbing." My voice remained steady, but there was steel beneath the calm surface. "You thought you could erase me from your narrative and replace me with a more convenient fiction." The documents on the table seemed to pulse with significance, each deed representing not just financial power, but a complete reversal of everything they had believed about their situation. "What happens now?" Harper asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I smiled, and for the first time in months, it was completely genuine. "Now, my dear, you learn that actions have consequences, and that the woman you've been dismissing as an embarrassment holds the power to transform your lives in ways you never imagined." The game had changed completely, and they were only beginning to understand just how thoroughly they had misunderstood the rules. The broken coffee mug remained scattered across the kitchen floor, its pieces catching the morning, light like fragments of Michael and Harper's shattered assumptions. Neither of them moved to clean it up. They seemed paralyzed by the magnitude of their miscalculation, staring at the property deeds spread across my kitchen table as if they were exhibits in a trial where they'd just been found guilty. Harper was the first to attempt recovery, her social training kicking in even as her world collapsed around her. She straightened in her chair, smoothing her designer blouse with trembling hands, trying to reassemble the confident facade that had served her so well. "Charlotte," she began, her voice artificially bright, "this is certainly unexpected. We had no idea about your business success. How wonderful that you've done so well for yourself. The attempt at damage control was almost admirable in its transparency." She was trying to reframe the revelation as a pleasant surprise rather than evidence of their cruel miscalculation, as if discovering I was wealthy somehow erased the conspiracy to exile me to institutional care. "Yes," I replied mildly. "I imagine. It is quite unexpected, particularly given your detailed research into Florida care facilities and your calculations about liquidating my assets to fund my exile." She flinched at the directness of my response, but pressed on with the determination of someone trying to salvage a sinking ship. "We were only trying to help. We thought you were struggling financially, that you needed support managing your affairs." "Did you?" I gathered the property deeds into a neat stack, each movement deliberate and unhurried. "Is that why you removed my photographs from the mantelpiece Saturday night? To help me manage my affairs?" Michael finally found his voice, though it came out strangled and uncertain. "Mom, please. I know how this looks, but we never meant to hurt you. We were trying to do what was best for everyone." I turned my attention to my son, studying the face I had loved unconditionally for 38 years, searching for some trace of the boy who used to bring me dandelions and call them flowers. What I saw instead was a man calculating his next move, already working to minimize the damage to his carefully constructed plans. "What was best for everyone?" I repeated thoughtfully. "Interesting phrase. Let's examine what your version of best looked like, shall we?" I reached into my folder and withdrew printouts of their email correspondence, placing them beside the property deeds. Harper's face went completely white as she recognized her own words laid out in black and white. Best for you meant gaining control of this house by convincing me to move to Florida. Best for you meant managing my finances without my knowledge or consent. Best for you meant erasing me from your social narrative so that Harper's parents would never have to acknowledge your humble origins. Michael started to speak, but I held up a hand to stop him. "I'm not finished. Best for you meant hiding me in the attic during your engagement party so your important guests wouldn't be subjected to my embarrassing presence. Best for you meant planning my future around your convenience rather than my preferences or dignity." The kitchen fell silent, except for the tick of the wall clock and Harper's barely audible breathing. She was staring at the email printouts as if they might spontaneously combust and solve her problems. "The question now," I continued, my voice remaining calm despite the storm of emotions building inside me, "is what happens next. You've spent considerable time and energy planning my future without consulting me. It seems only fair that I should return the favor." Harper's social training finally cracked under the pressure. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice sharp with panic. I smiled, and for the first time in months, I felt genuinely pleased with the direction of a conversation involving my son. "Well, you've made it clear that this house is too small for a couple planning to start a family." "You're absolutely right about that." Michael's eyes flickered with desperate hope. Perhaps he thought I was about to offer them one of my Willowbrook properties as a wedding gift, that family loyalty would override the betrayal he'd orchestrated. "The thing is," I continued, "I've grown quite attached to this neighborhood myself. In fact, I've decided to expand my local holdings." I reached into my folder one final time, withdrawing a document that made Harper gasp audibly. It was a purchase agreement for the entire Maple Street subdivision, including the house where we currently sat. As of this morning, I own every property on this street, including the houses belonging to the Hendersons, the Morrisons, and the Clarks. Lovely neighbors, all of them. They were quite happy to sell when I offered 20% above market value. Michael's mouth fell open. "You bought the whole neighborhood?" "I did. And given that this house is now too small for your future plans, I think it's time we discussed your living arrangements going forward." The power dynamic in the room had shifted so completely that I could almost feel the change in air pressure. Harper, who had spent Saturday evening explaining to her parents how Michael was overcoming his humble circumstances, was now facing the reality that those circumstances had been completely fictional. "What are you saying?" Michael asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. "I'm saying that effective immediately, you'll need to find alternative accommodations. This house is part of my property portfolio now, and I have different plans for it." Harper made a sound that was part gasp, part sob. "You're evicting us? Your own son?" "I'm suggesting that a couple planning to start their life together should probably start that life somewhere other than the home belonging to the mother. You've been planning to exile to institutional care?" The logic was unassailable, and they both knew it. Michael had spent years expressing his embarrassment about living in his childhood home, his eagerness to move somewhere more appropriate to his social ambitions. Now he was getting exactly what he'd claimed to want, just not in the way he'd planned. "Mom, please," Michael said, his voice taking on a pleading quality I hadn't heard since he was a child. "We made mistakes. We handled things badly. But we're family. Surely we can work this out." "Family," I repeated, tasting the word. "Yes, we are family. Which makes your behavior even more remarkable, doesn't it? Most families don't research institutional care facilities for their elderly relatives without consulting them. Most families don't plan to liquidate someone's assets for their own benefit." Harper was rapidly cycling through the stages of crisis management, moving from shock to denial to bargaining with impressive speed. "Charlotte, please. I know we made errors in judgment, but surely you can understand our position. We're young. We're starting out. We thought we were helping." "You thought you were helping by stealing my home and exiling me to Florida?" "We weren't stealing anything," she protested, though her voice lacked conviction. "We were trying to make arrangements that would benefit everyone." I laughed then, a sound that seemed to echo strangely in the transformed kitchen. "Benefit everyone? Yes, I can see how much thought you put into my benefits. The cramped attic room, the removal of my photographs, the detailed planning of my exile, all clearly designed with my welfare in mind." Michael was frantically scanning the documents on the table, as if he might find some loophole, some escape clause that would restore his original plan. "This is all so sudden. Can't we take some time to process this? To figure out a solution that works for everyone?" "Time," I mused. "How much time did you give me to process your plans for my future? How much input did you seek from me about selling my home and moving me to Florida?" The questions hung in the air unanswered, because we all knew the truth. They had made their decisions without consulting me, based on assumptions about my helplessness and their authority to control my life. "I'll need you both out by the end of the week," I said finally. "That should give you enough time to make alternative arrangements. I'm sure Harper's parents would be happy to help their daughter and her fiancé find suitable accommodations." The mention of Harper's parents hit like a physical blow. She visibly recoiled, probably imagining the conversation where she would have to explain to Judge Wilson that the humble circumstances they thought Michael was overcoming were actually a $52 million real estate empire, and that the woman they'd dismissed as irrelevant held more wealth than their entire social circle combined. "A week?" Michael's voice cracked. "Mom, we can't find a place in a week. The rental market is impossible right now, and with the wedding expenses, then perhaps you should consider postponing the wedding until you're in a more stable financial position," I suggested pleasantly. "After all, you've both made it clear that appearances matter tremendously to your social circle. I imagine hosting a wedding while living in temporary accommodations might send the wrong message. The full scope of the disaster was finally dawning on them. Not only had they lost their housing, they'd lost their entire narrative. The story of Michael's rise from modest circumstances was shattered, replaced by the reality that he'd betrayed the wealthiest person in his family. The tale of Harper's generous acceptance of a man beneath her station was revealed as cruel fiction. As they sat in stunned silence, processing the magnitude of their miscalculation, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: complete and utter peace with my decisions. They had taught me exactly who they were when they thought I had nothing to offer them. Now it was time for me to teach them who I really was, and what it cost to underestimate the woman they'd dismissed as an embarrassment. The next 3 days unfolded like a masterclass in human psychology under extreme pressure. Michael and Harper had initially believed my ultimatum was some sort of negotiating tactic, a dramatic gesture designed to extract an apology before returning to the status quo. They couldn't quite grasp that the woman they'd been planning to exile to institutional care had both the means and the resolve to fundamentally alter their lives. Tuesday brought their first real attempt at damage control. Harper arrived at my door dressed in subdued colors instead of her usual bold designer pieces, her demeanor carefully crafted to project humility and contrition. "Charlotte," she began, settling uninvited at my kitchen table. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since yesterday's revelation. I realize now that Michael and I may have made some assumptions that were unfair to you." I continued preparing my breakfast, noting how she phrased their conspiracy as assumptions rather than deliberate deception. "What kind of assumptions, dear?" "Well, about your financial situation, obviously. But more than that, about your preferences, your capabilities, your right to make your own decisions about your future." The careful wording was impressive, hitting all the right notes of acknowledgement without quite admitting to the calculated cruelty of their actual plan. She was treating this like a business negotiation, trying to find the minimum concession that would restore her access to what she now knew was a $52 million fortune. "And what conclusions have you reached from all this thinking?" I asked, settling across from her with my coffee. Harper leaned forward slightly, her expression earnest, in the way that suggested hours of practice in front of a mirror. "I think we got caught up in trying to help you without really listening to what you might want. That was wrong of us, and I'm genuinely sorry." "I see. And Michael shares this perspective?" A flicker of something, annoyance, frustration, crossed her face before she smoothed it away. "Michael is processing. This has been a shock for him, realizing how much he'd misunderstood about your situation." The delicate phrasing couldn't hide the reality that Michael was falling apart. I'd seen him through my window yesterday evening, pacing the backyard while making frantic phone calls, probably trying to find temporary housing while figuring out how to explain their sudden homelessness to his colleagues and Harper's parents. "Harper," I said gently, "what is it you're hoping to accomplish with this conversation?" She blinked, clearly having expected a more extended dance of apology and forgiveness before getting to the actual negotiation. "I'm hoping we can find a way to move forward as a family, to repair the damage that's been done and build something healthier." "By healthier, you mean what exactly?" "Well, obviously we need to rethink our living situation and our approach to communication. Maybe we could all sit down together and discuss what would work for everyone. Including you, of course." The "including you, of course" was particularly telling. Even now, even after discovering I owned a real estate empire, she was still positioning herself as the primary decision-maker, graciously including me in discussions about my own life. "That's thoughtful," I replied. "But I'm curious. In this healthier dynamic you're envisioning, what role do you see me playing?" Harper's carefully constructed composure wavered slightly. This wasn't the grateful acceptance she'd expected. "What do you mean?" "I mean, are you planning to include me in your social events? Introduce me to your parents as Michael's mother, rather than pretending I'm visiting Florida? Acknowledge my existence in your carefully curated narrative about Michael's rise from humble circumstances?" Each question hit like a physical blow. Harper's face cycled through a range of expressions as she realized that her apology had been based on the assumption that discovering my wealth would somehow erase the cruelty of how they'd treated me. "Of course," she said finally, though her voice lacked conviction. "Everything would be different now." "Different because I have money, you mean?" The blunt statement made her flinch. "Different because we understand each other better now." I smiled, appreciating the diplomatic evasion. "Do we? Because it seems to me that you understood me perfectly well before. You understood that I was someone who could be dismissed, hidden, away, lied about, and manipulated without consequence. The only thing that's changed is your knowledge of my bank balance." Harper's mask was beginning to slip, revealing the calculation beneath her contrition. "That's not fair, Charlotte. We made mistakes, yes, but we were trying to act in your best interests." "Were you?" "When you removed my photographs from the mantelpiece so your important guests wouldn't have to see evidence of Michael's modest background, were you acting in my best interests?" She opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again, apparently, realizing that any answer would only dig her deeper into the hole she'd created. "Or when you researched care facilities without my knowledge, calculated the costs of institutionalizing me, and planned to liquidate my assets to fund my exile. Were those actions motivated by concern for my welfare?" "We thought you needed help," she said weakly. "No, Harper. You thought you needed my house and my assets, and you convinced yourselves that stealing them was a favor you were doing for me." The conversation ended with Harper's retreat, her carefully planned reconciliation attempt having failed spectacularly. But it was Michael's response that truly revealed the depth of their miscalculation. Wednesday evening, he appeared at my door with red-rimmed eyes and the desperate air of someone whose entire world had collapsed. Gone was the confident young professional who'd been networking with judges and planning his rise through society's ranks. In his place stood a man forced to confront the reality of his own character. "Mom," he said, his voice breaking slightly, "I don't know how to fix this." I invited him in, noting how he moved through the house, his childhood home, like a stranger, seeing familiar spaces transformed by his new understanding of our family's actual circumstances. "What exactly are you trying to fix, Michael?" He collapsed into a kitchen chair, his head in his hands. "Everything. The wedding, our housing situation, Harper's parents' expectations, my job prospects." He looked up at me with genuine anguish. How do I explain to Judge Wilson that the humble background he was so graciously overlooking was actually a $52 million real estate empire? How do I tell my boss that the modest family circumstances I've been describing were complete fiction? For the first time since Saturday night, I felt a stirring of sympathy for my son. The elaborate deception he'd constructed was now collapsing around him, and he was finally understanding the cost of building a life on lies. "Why did you feel you needed to lie about our family circumstances in the first place?" I asked. Michael was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. "Because I was ashamed," he said finally. "The house, the discount store clothes, the coupon, clipping. It all seemed so small compared to Harper's world. I wanted to be someone worthy of her family's respect." "And you thought deceiving them was the way to earn that respect?" "I thought if I could just establish myself professionally, if I could prove I belonged in their circle, then our background wouldn't matter anymore." The sadness in his voice was genuine, but it couldn't erase the cruelty of his solution. "So, you decided to erase me from your narrative entirely." "Not erase," he protested weakly. "Just manage the situation until we were in a better position." "Manage the situation," I repeated. "Is that what you call planning to steal my home and exile me to institutional care?" Michael flinched as if I'd struck him. "We weren't stealing anything. We thought, God, Mom, we thought you were barely getting by on Dad's pension. We thought we were helping you plan for a future you couldn't afford to arrange yourself." Without consulting me, without respecting my autonomy or preferences, without acknowledging my right to make decisions about my own life. "Yes," he whispered, "and I can't figure out how to live with that." The admission was progress, but it came 20 years too late. I looked at my son, this man I'd raised with love and sacrifice, and saw someone who had been willing to betray family for social advancement, who had measured my worth by my perceived usefulness rather than our relationship. "Michael," I said gently, "the question isn't how you live with what you've done. The question is who you choose to become from this point forward." He looked up at me with something approaching hope. "Does that mean you'll consider letting us stay? Giving us another chance?" I studied his face, searching for signs of genuine transformation rather than mere desperation. It means that every relationship in your life is going to change now, whether you stay in this house or not. Harper's parents know who I am now. How will that affect your engagement? Your colleagues at work will eventually learn about your family's actual circumstances. How will that impact your carefully constructed professional image? The color drained from his face as he contemplated the full scope of the reckoning ahead. His entire social identity had been built on a foundation of lies, and now that foundation was crumbling. "What am I supposed to do?" he asked. And for a moment, I heard echoes of the little boy who used to come to me with scraped knees and broken toys. "You're supposed to decide what kind of man you want to be," I replied. "The kind who values authenticity over appearances, relationships over status, integrity over social advancement, or the kind who sees this setback as a temporary obstacle to overcome rather than a fundamental lesson about character." As Michael left that evening, his shoulders bowed under the weight of consequences he was only beginning to understand, I realized that the real test wasn't whether he could find new housing or salvage his engagement. The real test was whether he could find his way back to the values I'd tried to instill in him, or whether the lure of status and material success had permanently corrupted his character. The next few weeks would reveal which man he truly was beneath the elaborate deception he'd constructed, and my response to his transformation, or lack thereof, would determine whether our relationship could be salvaged or whether Saturday night's betrayal had severed the bonds between mother and son permanently. Part 9. Gradual Resolution. Our rebuilding on new terms 3. Months later, I stood in the kitchen of my renovated Maple Street home, watching through the window as Michael loaded boxes into a modest sedan that had replaced Harper's luxury SUV. The irony wasn't lost on me. He was finally moving out of his childhood home, just not in the way he'd originally planned. The transformation had been remarkable to witness. After Harper's parents learned the truth about my financial status, a revelation that came when Michael could no longer maintain his elaborate fiction, the Wilson family's attitude toward the engagement had shifted dramatically. Suddenly, their daughter's choice to marry beneath her station became a strategic alliance with significant financial potential. But Harper herself had struggled with the new dynamic. The woman who had once dismissed me as an embarrassment now found herself in the uncomfortable position of courting someone she'd been planning to exile to institutional care. Her attempts at building a relationship with me had been transparently motivated by access to my wealth rather than genuine affection or respect. "The final box is from the garage," Michael said, appearing in the kitchen doorway. His appearance had changed over the past months, less polished, more genuine somehow. The expensive suits had been replaced by practical clothing, the carefully styled hair now simply neat rather than professionally coiffed. "Good," I replied, not looking up from the morning paper. "The moving truck should be here shortly for the furniture." We'd settled into this careful politeness over the weeks, a formal courtesy that acknowledged our relationship while maintaining the boundaries I'd established. Michael had initially fought against my decision to evict them, oscillating between anger and pleading, but eventually he'd accepted that the consequences of his actions couldn't be negotiated away. "Mom," he said, lingering in the doorway, "I know you probably don't want to hear this again, but I need you to know how sorry I am. Not just about the house or the money, but about everything. About how we treated you." I set down my coffee cup, studying his face for signs of manipulation or calculation. What I saw instead was genuine remorse, the kind that comes from truly understanding the harm you've caused rather than simply regretting the consequences. "I appreciate that, Michael. Though I notice you said we treated you. What about Harper's role in all this?" His expression tightened slightly. Harper had not handled the past 3 months well. The revelation of my wealth had created impossible cognitive dissonance for her. She couldn't reconcile her need to curry favor with me, against her fundamental belief that I was beneath her family's standards. Her attempts at relationship building had been so transparently self-serving that even Michael had begun to see through them. "Harper is struggling with the situation," he said carefully. "She's having difficulty adjusting to the new reality." "Which reality is that? The one where I'm not actually the impoverished burden you both believed me to be?" Michael winced at the directness of my statement. "The reality where she can't pretend you don't exist anymore. Where she has to confront the fact that we were wrong about everything." It was progress, this acknowledgement of their shared delusion. But I sensed there was more he wanted to say. "And how are you adjusting to this new reality?" I asked. He was quiet for a long moment, gathering his thoughts. "It's been humbling," he said finally. "Realizing how completely I misunderstood my own life, my own family. Seeing how easily I was willing to—" He stopped, unable to finish the sentence. "To betray me for social advancement?" "Yes." The word came out as barely a whisper. Over the past months, Michael's world had slowly unraveled. His colleagues at work had eventually learned about his family's true circumstances, creating awkward conversations about why he'd portrayed himself as coming from modest means. His relationship with Harper had grown increasingly strained as she struggled to integrate her disdain for me with her desire to access my wealth. "Where will you go?" I asked, more curious than concerned. "I found a small apartment downtown. Nothing fancy, but it's clean and affordable." He paused. "Harper's parents offered to help us find something more suitable, but I declined." This surprised me. The Michael of 6 months ago would have jumped at any opportunity to benefit from the Wilson family's connections and resources. Why? Because I need to figure out who I am when I'm not trying to impress anyone or live up to someone else's expectations. These past months have shown me that I don't actually know myself very well. The insight was more mature than anything I'd heard from him in years. "And Harper? How does she feel about your newfound independence?" Michael's expression grew pained. "She doesn't understand it. She thinks I'm being stubborn, that I should accept her parents' help and use it to rebuild our social position. She can't comprehend why I'd want to start over with less when we could start over with more." "And what do you think about that?" "I think she's the same person she's always been, and I'm finally seeing clearly what that means." Before I could respond, a car pulled into the driveway. Harper's new sedan, another downgrade from her previous luxury vehicle. Through the window, I watched her sit in the driver's seat for several minutes, apparently steeling herself for whatever conversation she'd come to have. "She's here," Michael said unnecessarily. "So I see. Are you ready for this?" He nodded, though his expression suggested otherwise. Over the past week, they'd been having increasingly difficult conversations about their future together, conversations that Harper had apparently decided needed to involve me. Harper entered the kitchen with the careful composure of someone approaching a difficult negotiation. She'd abandoned her usual designer outfits for something more modest, though her attempt at humility was undermined by the calculation visible in her eyes. "Charlotte," she said, her voice carefully modulated. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with us." I hadn't actually agreed to anything. She'd simply announced through Michael that she needed to have a conversation with both of us. But I gestured for her to sit at the table where, months ago, I'd revealed the truth about my financial empire. "What can I do for you, Harper?" She took a deep breath, launching into what was clearly a prepared speech. "I've been doing a lot of reflection over the past few months, and I realized that Michael and I made some serious errors in judgment regarding your situation." The careful phrasing was impressive. Errors in judgment, rather than deliberate cruelty. Your situation, rather than acknowledging their conspiracy to steal my home and exile me to institutional care. "I want you to know that I take full responsibility for my part in the misunderstanding," she continued. "And I'm hoping we can find a way to move forward as a family." "What does moving forward look like to you?" I asked. Harper glanced at Michael, who remained studiously neutral. Clearly, this conversation wasn't going as she'd planned. "Well, obviously the living situation needs to be resolved. Michael and I have found a temporary apartment. but it's quite small and not really suitable. For long-term, she trailed off, apparently realizing how her words sounded. You're asking if I'll provide you with housing. I'm asking if we can find a solution that works for everyone. You have multiple properties, and Michael and I need a place to start. Our married life that's appropriate for our social obligations. The audacity was breathtaking. Even now, even after everything that had happened, she was still approaching me as a resource to be tapped rather than a person to be respected. Harper, I said gently, do you understand why I'm reluctant to make my properties available to you? She blinked, apparently having expected immediate agreement to her reasonable request. Because you're still upset about our miscommunication? Miscommunication. I repeated the word thoughtfully. Is that what you call your plan to institutionalize me against my will? Her composure finally cracked slightly. We were trying to help. We thought you needed assistance managing your affairs. Without consulting me, without respecting my autonomy, without acknowledging my right to make decisions about my own life. But that's all changed now, she said desperately. We understand your situation better. We would never make the same mistakes again. Michael, who had been silent throughout this exchange, finally spoke. Harper, stop. She turned to him with surprise. Stop what? Stop pretending this is about family or misunderstandings or wanting to help. You're asking my mother for housing because you can't afford the lifestyle you want on our actual income. You're treating her like a bank rather than a person. Harper's face flushed with anger. That's not fair, Michael. Your mother is family, and family helps each other. Family, I interjected quietly, doesn't usually research institutional care for elderly relatives without their knowledge. Family doesn't typically plan to liquidate someone's assets for their own benefit. The kitchen fell silent, except for the tick of the wall clock. Harper stared at me with undisguised frustration, apparently unable to understand why her apology and request weren't being received more favorably. What do you want from us? She asked finally. What would it take for you to forgive us and help us move forward? It was the wrong question, revealing that she still didn't understand the fundamental issue. She was treating forgiveness as a transaction, help as something owed rather than freely given. I don't want anything from you, Harper, I said honestly. But I do want something for you. I want you to develop the capacity for genuine relationships based on mutual respect rather than transactional benefit. She stared at me blankly, clearly not understanding what I meant. Michael, however, nodded slowly. She's saying we need to prove we value her as a person, not as a source of financial support. But how do we do that? Harper asked, her frustration evident. By not asking for financial support, Michael replied quietly. By building a relationship with her that isn't based on what she can provide for us. As understanding dawned on Harper's face, I saw the exact moment she realized that access to my wealth wasn't going to be automatically restored simply because she'd offered an apology. The future she'd envisioned, where my financial resources would solve their housing problems and restore their social status, was slipping away. This is ridiculous, she said, her mask finally falling completely. You're punishing us for trying to help you. We made one mistake, and now you're holding it over our heads forever. One mistake, I repeated. Planning to steal my home, exile me to institutional care, and liquidate my assets without my consent. If that's one mistake, Harper, I'd hate to see what you consider a serious betrayal. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. Fine, I can see this conversation is pointless. Michael, are you coming? Michael remained seated, looking between Harper and me with an expression I couldn't quite read. I think I'll stay and help Mom finish cleaning up, he said finally. Harper's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, anger, calculation, and finally cold resolve. I see. Well, when you're ready to have a rational conversation about our future, you know where to find me. After she left, Michael and I sat in comfortable silence for several minutes. Through the window, I watched her car disappear down the street, carrying with it the last remnants of the life they'd been trying to build on deception and manipulation. "That didn't go well," Michael observed. "No," I agreed. "But it was honest, which is more than I can say for most of our recent family conversations." He nodded, understanding the significance of that distinction. We'd spent months dancing around the truth, trying to rebuild our relationship while avoiding the fundamental issues that had driven us apart. Today's conversation had finally brought everything into the open. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now," I said. "You decide what kind of man you want to be, and what kind of relationships you want to build. Independent of my financial status, independent of social expectations, independent of what anyone else thinks you should do." As Michael prepared to leave for his modest downtown apartment, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: cautious optimism about our future relationship. The road ahead would be difficult, requiring genuine transformation rather than surface changes. But for the first time since that devastating Saturday night, I believed it might be possible to rebuild something authentic between mother and son. The test would be whether Michael could maintain this newfound clarity when faced with the social and financial pressures that had corrupted his character in the first place. Only time would tell if the lesson had truly been learned. 6 months after Michael moved into his modest downtown apartment, I received an unexpected phone call that would test everything we'd learned about authentic relationships and genuine transformation. "Mrs. Miller?" The voice was unfamiliar, professional but warm. "This is Jennifer Walsh from Riverside Community College. I'm calling about the scholarship application submitted by your son, Michael Brown." I paused, setting down my morning coffee. Michael had taken his father's surname when he'd started rebuilding his life, a symbolic gesture that represented his decision to honor his authentic heritage rather than the fictional narrative he'd constructed. "I wasn't aware Michael had applied for any scholarships," I said carefully. "He's applied for our continuing education program in social work. The application includes a personal essay about his experiences with family dynamics and his desire to help other families navigate difficult transitions. It's quite compelling, actually." After ending the call, I sat in my renovated kitchen, the same space where I'd revealed my hidden fortune 9 months earlier, and reflected on how dramatically everything had changed. The house no longer felt like a museum to Michael's childhood, but had become a true home, decorated with my own preferences rather than camouflaged to hide my supposed limitations. Through the window, I could see the garden I'd finally had the freedom to design according to my tastes. Roses climbed elegant trellises, herb gardens provided fresh ingredients for cooking, and a small greenhouse allowed me to pursue the botanical interests I'd long suppressed in favor of maintaining my modest facade. Michael arrived an hour later, looking nervous in a way that reminded me of the boy who'd once come to confess breaking a neighbor's window with an errant baseball. "Mom, I need to talk to you about something important." I gestured for him to sit at the kitchen table, where so many crucial conversations had taken place over the past months. "Jennifer Walsh from the community college called me this morning." His face flushed slightly. "I was going to tell you about the scholarship application. I just wanted to make sure I was accepted first." "Social work?" I asked, genuinely curious about this unexpected career direction. Michael nodded, his expression growing serious. "I've been volunteering at the Family Crisis Center downtown, helping people navigate housing issues and elder care situations. It's shown me how many families struggle with the same dynamics we went through. Adult children making decisions for parents without consulting them, financial pressures creating moral compromises, social expectations, corrupting genuine relationships." The transformation in his perspective was remarkable. The man who had once been embarrassed by his working-class background was now choosing a career dedicated to helping others facing similar challenges. "What about your finance career?" I asked. "I resigned last month. I realized I'd chosen that path for all the wrong reasons. Status, money, social acceptance. I was good at it, but it wasn't meaningful work for me." This was news to me, though it explained why his visits over the past few weeks had seemed different somehow. Less fraught, more purposeful. And Harper? How does she feel about this career change? Michael's expression grew somber. Harper and I ended our engagement 3 weeks ago. I wasn't entirely surprised, but I was curious about the timing. What happened? She gave me an ultimatum. Either I'd ask you for financial help to maintain our original lifestyle plans, or she'd leave. She couldn't understand why I was choosing social work over finance, why I was living in a small apartment when my mother owned a real estate empire, why I wasn't leveraging our family relationship for social and financial advantage. And you chose social work. I chose authenticity over convenience, meaningful relationships over transactional ones. I chose to become the kind of person who deserves your respect rather than someone who demands it because of family obligation. The growth in his character over the past months had been gradual, but undeniable. The desperate, calculating man who'd been willing to exile me to institutional care had evolved into someone capable of genuine self-reflection and moral courage. "I'm proud of you, Michael," I said, meaning it completely. His eyes filled with tears he didn't try to hide. "I don't deserve your pride. Not after what I did to you." To you. "Maybe not 6 months ago," I agreed. "But people can change, and you've proven that transformation is possible when someone commits to doing the hard work of examining their character and values." We talked for another hour about his plans for school, his work at the crisis center, and his hopes for building a career that would help other families avoid the mistakes he'd made. As he prepared to leave, he hesitated at the door. "Mom, there's something else I need to say. I've learned that Harper's parents are facing some financial difficulties. Judge Wilson made some poor investment decisions, and they're having to downsize significantly. Harper's been calling me, asking if I think you might be willing to help them through this rough patch." I raised an eyebrow. "And what did you tell her?" "I told her that if her family needs financial assistance, they should approach you directly and honestly, not try to manipulate me into being their intermediary. I also told her that she'd need to be prepared to build a genuine relationship with you based on mutual respect, not just access to your resources." The wisdom in his response demonstrated just how far he'd traveled from the man who'd been willing to betray family for social advancement. "That was exactly the right answer," I said. 3 weeks later, I received a formal letter from Patricia Wilson, written on expensive stationery that couldn't quite disguise the desperation beneath its elegant surface. She requested a meeting to discuss mutual interests and potential collaboration opportunities. The language was careful, professional, and completely transparent in its true purpose. I agreed to meet her at a downtown cafe, curious to see whether Harper's mother had learned anything from her daughter's failed attempt at reconciliation. Patricia arrived precisely on time, dressed in understated elegance that suggested financial constraint rather than choice. She'd aged noticeably since the engagement party, stress lines visible around her eyes despite expertly applied makeup. "Charlotte," she said, extending a manicured hand. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me." "Of course, Patricia. How can I help you?" She settled into her chair with the careful dignity of someone maintaining appearances despite difficult circumstances. "I'll be direct, if you don't mind. My family is facing some financial challenges, and I wanted to explore whether there might be opportunities for collaboration between us." I appreciated the straightforward approach, even if the euphemisms couldn't quite hide the reality of her situation. "What kind of collaboration did you have in mind?" "Well, you have extensive real estate holdings, and I have connections throughout the county's legal and social communities. There might be mutually beneficial arrangements we could explore." She was offering to leverage her social connections in exchange for financial assistance, a more sophisticated version of the transactional approach that had characterized all of my interactions with her family. "Patricia," I said gently, "before we discuss any business arrangements, I think we need to address some fundamental issues about how your family has treated me. Her composure faltered slightly. I'm not sure what you mean. I mean that 6 months ago, you and your husband dismissed me as an embarrassment to be hidden away during social events. You spoke about me as if I were a limitation Michael needed to overcome, rather than a person deserving of basic respect. Patricia's face flushed, but to her credit, she didn't deny the accusation. We made assumptions based on appearances rather than taking the time to know you properly. That was wrong of us. It was. And now that you know about my financial status, you're interested in building a relationship. Do you understand why that feels problematic to me? She was quiet for a long moment, staring into her untouched coffee cup. When she finally spoke, her voice was smaller than I'd ever heard it. We're going to lose our house, Charlotte. William's investment losses were substantial. We've already had to let go of most of the staff, and the mortgage payments are becoming impossible to maintain. The admission cost her considerable pride, I could see. Patricia Wilson had built her identity around social status and financial superiority, and acknowledging her family's vulnerability was clearly devastating. I'm sorry to hear that, I said sincerely. Financial difficulties are always stressful. The thing is, she continued, Harper has been telling us about your holdings, about the scope of your real estate empire, and I can't help but think that someone with your resources and our connections could accomplish remarkable things together. Even in desperation, she couldn't quite abandon the transactional framework that had defined all of her relationships. Everything was still about what each party could provide to the other, rather than genuine human connection. Patricia, what would you say if I told you I was willing to help your family through this difficult period? Her eyes lit with hope that she tried unsuccessfully to disguise. I'd say we would be enormously grateful and eager to discuss terms that work for everyone. And what if I said that help would come with no expectation of business collaboration, no leveraging of your social connections, no quid pro quo arrangements of any kind? She looked confused, as if I'd spoken in a foreign language. I don't understand. What would you want in return? Nothing transactional. But I would want acknowledgement of how your family treated me when you thought I had nothing to offer you. I would want genuine respect moving forward, not the performative courtesy you extend to people you're trying to impress. And I would want an authentic relationship based on mutual regard rather than mutual benefit. Patricia struggled visibly with this concept. Her entire social framework was built around exchanges of status, influence, and resources. The idea of help without strings attached, of relationships not based on mutual advantage, seemed to challenge everything she understood about how the world worked. That's very generous, she said finally. It's very simple, I corrected. It's how genuine relationships function. Over the following months, I quietly assisted the Wilson family through their financial crisis, helping them restructure their debts and find more sustainable living arrangements. But more importantly, I watched as Patricia gradually learned to interact with me as a person rather than a resource. The transformation wasn't easy for her. Decades of viewing relationships through a transactional lens couldn't be undone overnight. But slowly, tentatively, she began to show genuine interest in my thoughts, opinions, and experiences, rather than just my capacity to solve her problems. Michael's scholarship application was successful, and he began his social work studies with the passion of someone who had found his true calling. His work at the Crisis Center had given him insights into family dynamics that no textbook could provide, and his professors were impressed by the depth of understanding he brought to discussions about elder care, family manipulation, and the psychology of financial abuse. I've been assigned to work with a family whose adult children are trying to convince their father to sign over power of attorney so they can sell his house and move him to assisted living, he told me during one of our weekly dinners. The parallels to our situation are uncomfortable but educational. What advice are you giving them? To slow down the process, ensure the father has independent legal counsel and examine their motivations honestly. Most importantly, to include him in every decision and respect his autonomy even if they disagree with his choices. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. Michael was now professionally dedicated to preventing the kind of elder abuse he'd once been willing to perpetrate against his own mother. As I write this, sitting in my garden on a perfect spring morning, I'm struck by how completely my life has transformed since that humiliating night in the attic. The house that had once felt like a prison of modest appearances now serves as a true home where I can live authentically without hiding my success or diminishing my accomplishments. My relationship with Michael has been rebuilt on a foundation of honesty and mutual respect rather than obligation and assumption. He's become a man I'm genuinely proud to call my son, not because of his career success or social status, but because of his character and his commitment to meaningful work. The Willowbrook Estates properties continue to appreciate in value, but, more importantly, they've become homes for families who demonstrate the values I want to support: integrity, authenticity, and genuine respect for others regardless of their financial status. I've established a foundation dedicated to elder rights and family mediation, using my resources to help other families navigate the complex dynamics that can destroy relationships when money and status become more important than love and respect. The fortune I built over decades of careful investment has given me something more valuable than financial security. It's given me the freedom to live according to my values, to demand the respect I deserve, and to use my resources to create positive change in my community. Looking back on that terrible Saturday night when my own son banished me to the attic while plotting to steal my home and exile me to institutional care, I can see that it was the catalyst for the most important transformation of my life. Not just the revelation of my hidden wealth, but the discovery of my own strength, dignity, and worth. Sometimes the greatest gift we can give ourselves is the courage to stop diminishing who we are to make others comfortable. Sometimes the most loving thing we can do for family is to hold them accountable for their actions and insist they become worthy of the relationships they claim to value. I am Charlotte Miller, owner of a $52 million real estate empire, devoted mother, community leader, and a woman who learned that true wealth lies not in what we possess, but in living authentically and demanding the respect we deserve. And I have never been happier to be exactly who I am. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.